Whenever we say something's odd, we're usually not aware of how we feel about it. We use this term when describing things we can't yet decide on, where we don't know what we've really experienced, and the only thing that we're aware of is the feeling of ambiguity. Looking around ourselves will maybe not make it instantly visible to us, but as believers that the world is built on a scaffolding of mathematics, we can't deny that even odd numbers exist. We see them in interior design, when purposefully chosen items are picked in odd numbers to please the viewer's eye, when walking down a stairway and the landing floor ends on an odd number to follow the natural movement of the body, or in the so-called rule of three, when everything we see seems to look just better when cut into three in an odd proportion. Miuccia seems to have that talent of seeing odd things straight up and interpret them in her collections. Today we're analyzing the work and strategy of Miuccia Prada and what makes Prada, Prada, and the oddness that involuntarily turned into the visual identity of the brand that now makes people love or hate the brand. And one thing she said that makes it pretty clear to us why she chose the root of oddness is when she said, the moment you start being in love with what you're doing and thinking it's beautiful or rich, then you're in danger. You have to always work against what you did before, and even against your taste. This is what she said to Cathy Horn in the year 2000, when Cathy Horn was still working for the New York Times, and it feels like 25 years later, not much of Miuccia Prada's attitude has changed. And to understand her vision on life and design a bit better, we will have to dig deep into it today, and that's what we're about to do. We're digging today. And if you like videos like this, don't forget to subscribe to the Patreon, where you have access to professional designer interviews, business professional live talks where we just ask them random questions from designers to buyers to everything, and also have the Discord access guaranteed, where you can talk with all the people on the Discord. We are everywhere in the world with the cutest and best and most stylish people. I'm very sorry to say that, but what's the most important? We're the kindest, and it's a beautiful community that I use daily, and I think that's the most important thing. And community is actually pretty relevant in today's video, so we're gonna dig deeper into this as well. So join the Patreon, have more access to videos and a beautiful community, and let's start. Miuccia Prada, born Maria Bianchi, is the granddaughter of Mario Prada, the founder of Fratelli Prada in 1913 in Milan. She was born in Milan in 1949 to an industrial family, and despite her background, she developed progressive political views, joining the Italian Communist Party in the 1970s. She earned a PhD in political science from the University of Milan and trained as a mime at Milano's Piccolo Teatro, reflecting her interest in performance and the arts. When Miuccia's grandfather founded the brand in 1913, he established it as Fratelli Prada, the Prada brothers, in the prestigious Galleria Vittorio Emanuele II in Milan. The shop specialized in exceptionally high-quality travel goods. Initially, Miuccia Prada showed very little interest in the family company because she was busy with having a PhD and being on the streets and protesting for feminism and left-wing rights. And her intellectual interests seemed at odds with the luxury fashion world she is later supposed to revolutionize. We will get later into this. In 1978, at age 29, she reluctantly joined the family business founded by her grandfather. At that time, Prada was a respected but relatively small leather goods company known for its high-quality travel accessories and handbags favored by the European aristocracy. But the business had stagnated and was failing to connect with contemporary consumers. Being a political science student and active in the Italian Communist Party, meanwhile working for a global luxury leather goods brand sounds more than contrary, but this is what it's all about. Because when Miuccia is being asked how she feels as a designer, she usually says she doesn't feel like a designer. In an interview with Michael Spector in 2004 for The New Yorker, she says, "I make clothes, that's silly, but that's my job." It feels almost like she feels sorry for creating fashion. But keeping in mind that her ideological view on the world is based on freedom, feminism, and artistic expression, fashion seems like the materialized version of all these things. She says in another interview in 2012 that turning into a designer was the worst thing that could have happened to her. She thought it was dumb and conservative. But her education at home pulled her completely into a different direction, and that's where she finally understood the relevance that fashion can have. But the main thing differentiating her from other designers that also kind of managed to deal with fashion at the end is that her goals are completely different than what a usual designer is aiming for, which is a successful and good-looking collection. Because there is no goal, she resists any form of satisfaction. She says, "I'm always thinking about the next thing, so I don't enjoy anything." This perpetual forward motion kind of characterizes her approach to both fashion and culture. For example, Whenever she receives any kind of praise for the Fondazione Prada, which is the cultural foundation of the brand Prada nowadays, with its libraries, cinema, the big square, and tons of arts, she dismisses any of that, especially when people tell her what kind of generous work she created with founding the Fondazione. And this is where her sophistication and humbleness kicks in, because she doesn't want to be perceived as somebody generous. She says, I never initiated or wanted to be generous. I created something, and the result is now something that people can benefit of. This might appear generous, but that was never my intention. And she is absolutely open with that. She says, I started with an idea which was to do something that I think is important and relevant. I wanted to make culture attractive to the young, so they would see that it is necessary to your life. And here we see again that she never has a clear goal or something she wants to reach for. No achievement, nothing is planned, not in numbers and not in achievements, nothing. All she does has only purpose. And whatever the result is, that's what people can take. But whatever she's creating needs to have a purpose. And her belief in cultural enrichment is kind of reflecting her idea that art always has to serve a purpose. It needs to have a function and something that is beyond aesthetics. And even if this sounds like the perfect strategy to intellectualize a brand and make it a bit more diverse and interesting and sophisticated towards others, she actually only says that she's just following her instinct all the time. She doesn't question it. And whenever you see reviews of Miuccia Prada being interviewed after shows, usually the press asks her very complex questions and her answers are pretty simple, because that's exactly what she felt. So for Miuccia Prada, culture is not something decorative. It's not about the savoir-faire or something. It needs to really answer political and existential questions. And that's why she deliberately chooses a combination of smaller and bigger artists with thematic exhibitions instead of focusing completely on one artist only, because she wants exhibitions that investigate a bit more the broader cultural and intellectual questions. And if you look at the Fondazione Prada in detail, you will have figured that there is a deliberate separation between fashion and art that Miuccia Prada and her husband Patrizio Bertelli chose to have, because the least that they want is that it just looks like another esoteric way of selling handbags, to make your handbags that are actually just luxury items seem a bit more intellectual. That's what they don't want, and they know it's not realistic, and that's why Miuccia Prada says there's a separation. And if you now enter the Fondazione Prada, you will be aware, or maybe you're not aware because it doesn't exist, there's almost no relation to the fashion house Prada in there. And seeing this ambivalence of the separation between fashion and art and culture and all these questions that are being asked around Miuccia Prada, it feels like she was forced to design for Prada. And that's actually funny, because she was kind of forced to design. She didn't choose to be a designer. And I think that's a very distinct differentiation to a lot of other designers. She didn't choose this way. It was actually her husband, Patrizio Bertelli, who forced her to be more involved, and otherwise he would have booked another creative director. And once she heard that, she said, no way. I'm taking care of it. And maybe that's exactly the point that turned her into such an instinctive designer that makes it so hard for us to capture what she creates, because it is not based on fundamental rules of design and fashion and history. Maybe it is really very instinctive. And maybe it's just a bit more irrelevant of what an item stands for. Is it historical? What's the reference? Is it a heritage? I think the question reference should be something you should never use in the context of speaking about Prada's designs. It is never about a reference. It is never important. And this is something you see in the designs that I'm going to talk about right now. It is so interesting to see that what she creates only has the purpose to have a question and for us to think about something. It's not really about the clothing. And I know this sounds kind of delusional, but it makes sense. It makes sense because people ask her when she has a great achievement, let's say a great collection, and the reviews are amazing and the editors loved it, and she's being asked, are you happy with it? She just says, no, I'm not, because I didn't have a goal. Like, what is the goal of this collection? I don't have a goal. I just act and react, and something evolves. Like, it is so abstract the way that she perceives the process of creating fashion. Even the result itself is very abstract. And that's what makes people not understand it, because it's not very clear. It's not a stream from A to B. We don't know where she comes from, and we don't know where it's gonna end. It makes kind of no sense. But from all these reflections that I talked about interviews, what her thought processes are, I feel like we have three very important values for Miuccia Prada. First thing is that she's instinctive, which means she just creates for the sake of creating, but it's not only the result that is relevant. It's actually just the process that is relevant and what it evokes and what it creates afterwards. It is always the political, existential, and intellectual questions she has within a collection. It's kind of an art project. It's way more a project than just a fashion collection. It results in real life pieces that we can purchase, that's true, but the process is instinctive. That means she reacts to things in her body and reacts and acts, and these create kind of some things out of that we maybe find visually pleasing sometimes, but actually they serve a different purpose, which is, what are you doing with it? The second thing is her humbleness. And I know that's a personal characteristic and should maybe not be confused with the creative process, but I think it's an initial part of why she is so successful. We're living in a self-centered society. I can't imagine it has ever been worse, since we all have a camera in front of our nose and we all can be famous. But I think the fact that she's distancing herself so much from her achievements and not communicating her goals, or the fact that she just doesn't have any goals, are things that are showing that she's working for a bigger purpose. If she wanted it to be about her, she would call it Miuccia Prada Fondazione and push everywhere that they are pushing cultural projects. But if you see the Biennale, if you go to Venice, if you see how they work, you will see that Prada is really about art and art only for the sake of people, just to serve them. And it's never for the company goals. So I think the fact that she reduces herself, is very reserved when it comes to speaking about achievements, shows that she is a very sophisticated and professional and humble person. And the third point, and the one that is probably distinguishing her the most from any other fashion brand, is her development of culture, which is kind of based on the idea of humbleness, in my opinion, because it shows that she wants to create things that enrich a certain form of understanding that fashion alone cannot do. And the fact that she invests so much in the Fondazione and in the artists that are there, by the way, whenever you have a chance, you should definitely check it out. It's a beautiful contemporary exhibition every time, and it's very interesting, the selection that she has. I think it's very distinct and differentiating also from other brand-based museums that we have all over the world, especially the big global players. I think the Fondazione is definitely the underdog that is supporting a lot more the younger artists here as well. And since they managed to turn fashion into a cultural dialogue, it's what elevates the brand the most, and it's honest, and that's why it works. So this is kind of the philosophy, the background, the ideology of the brand Prada. But if we want to think of odd things, because I didn't mention so many odd things here, I think the contrary life that Miuccia Prada has is the biggest oddness already, and I wanted to start with this because I think it's the fundament of everything. Being in pieces, being parted, having several ways. The way that she tries to differentiate between art and culture and fashion is also what she has in herself when creating certain pieces. And if we look on the runways, we see that as well. Because when we think of luxury fashion, our minds might immediately go to luxuriously soft cashmeres, wools, leathers, monograms, checkered prints, interlocked initials of logos, all these things. But if you look at Prada, especially in the past, you don't see any of those things. What is also interesting actually is the first item that brought the brand Prada back to relevancy after Miuccia Prada took over the brand was the nylon backpack. It's of course the most iconic piece, which was created, inspired by the military parachutes, or maybe it is even military parachute fabric. And it was a huge change in the 70s because a lot of fashion was still like mainly inspired by couture, and it was a lot about like embellishments and strong patterns and stuff that makes you look rich. And a nylon backpack that some people might consider was made out of a trash bag, because what is nylon parachute anyway, was pretty revolutionary back then. And even with that product, Miuccia Prada did not put a logo on the first nylon backpack. She didn't want to have that. I mean, that's of course a sign of understatement, and we don't have that nowadays anymore, but that's how she initially started to work with Prada. She didn't want to have any logo, and after a lot of pressure from the designs and assistant creative teams, the only logo, and the only logo only that you could see on the backpacks, were the famous metallic triangles. And these also have a historical reference because it is exactly the triangle that her grandfather Mario Prada used to use when he designed the steam trunks that Prada was so famous for in the 1920s. And the odd and influential thing about the Prada patterns now is that they're so intellectually rigor. Instead of creating patterns designed to simply please the eye, Miuccia Prada has consistently developed visual motives that challenge and provoke any thought of a beautiful pattern. For example, my favorites, the famous ugly patterns, ugly prints, the ugly chicness of the 1990s, that left a lot of people very unhappy very, very much unhappy. And of course, she deliberately chose aesthetically challenging patterns consisting of browns, avocado greens, oranges, ochres, colors that are maybe not identified as the first female gaze supporting colors in the fashion industry. And she loved it. It was disturbing. And all these patterns weren't even references. They were just intellectual provocations. By taking the ugly and repositioning it into a luxury runway, she forced a reconsideration of what constitutes real beauty. And these patterns have a purpose, which is making you ask questions about how we live in our current environment and how we should slowly start thinking. It's like a little hit on the head to finally wake us up and make us question things that we're being shown all the time, constantly, actually. It's like, is this really what you consider beauty? What makes this different? Why do you find this ugly? She's forcing us to question ourselves by showing us odd things where we cannot even immediately say why we find it odd. And that's the power of Miuccia Prada. And of course, a lot of the prints were inspired by the 70s, because where else can one pattern represent the financial dependence and difficulty of women who take care of their families and households, while also represent the female revolution starting in the 60s, whose results have shaped the world we live in until now. And in the book Prada Sphere, there's one thing being mentioned specifically about the Prada Fall 2014 show. And there they say, the accidental is in fact deliberate. All these choices that look like they were randomly placed on a mood board are in fact chosen with the biggest consciousness. And instinct is probably the most important keyword when it comes to understanding Miuccia Prada's creative process. Because how else could you explain how a spring 1994 collection that is based on subtle features, transparency, lightweightedness, all these things, has probably a cultural and intellectual reference, while also the fall 2014 show that looks like it's pouring down excessiveness has also a cultural relevancy. Every season needs to look different, because every season there are new questions. We have a new surrounding, a new environment, and Miuccia Prada adapts to her surrounding. And that's why every collection looks so different. And since she's not so self-centered and doesn't say, this is my aesthetic and I will go for this forever, she's adapting to the surroundings. She gets inspired by different things every season, and that's the main reason why every single show of Miuccia Prada looks completely different from each other. And you're just like, how is this possible? Please explain to me. It's what happens if you trust your instincts, your so-called gut feeling. And it's by adapting to your surroundings, and with adapting, it doesn't mean that you fit in. It means that you react to it, and that there is also a form of action coming out of it. So you're just expressing your surrounding in a different way, and that's the beauty of the way Miuccia Prada works. It's just instinctive. So we talked about her philosophy and patterns. But what about the designs of Miuccia Prada? The one that we love so much. I guess everybody here in this channel loves Miuccia Prada's designs. It better be so. Anyway, what about them? What is something you think of when you see something walking down the runway at a Prada show? This is something I would really like to know. You can leave it in the comments. What do you feel usually the first time you see a Prada runway? What is the first kind of thoughts, the questions that are coming up when you see the runway? Do you have things that always come up? Because design is probably the thing where we see the Prada oddity the strongest pronounced. Because at the heart of the brand's design philosophy is what I like to call intellectual minimalism, a restrained approach that paradoxically communicates complex ideas. Unlike houses that broadcast wealth through obvious ornamentation, Prada has mastered the art of very subtle subversion. Prada consistently plays with proportion in ways that challenge the conventional ideas of flattery. The Fall 2015 collection featured deliberately awkward hemlines that hit at the least conventionally flattering points on the leg. In the Spring-Summer 2019, oversized headbands were so exaggerated they became almost architectural elements rather than just beautiful accessories. We saw water polo swimwear caps in the Fall 24 menswear show that were probably also referencing the Fall 2007 women's wear show. And in context of design, I think material subversion and the play with patterns and fabrics is one of the strongest things that Miuccia Prada is doing. The brand has made synthetic materials like polyester and vinyl feel more luxurious than silks or cashmere, while sometimes treating precious materials with deliberate casualness. And this inversion kind of challenges the hierarchy of materials that underpins the traditional luxury. And yes, not even the patterns and fabrics are safe from the idea to break the hierarchy. because that's what it's all about. We also see technical innovation with retro elements that create another layer of oddity, and Prada will often employ cutting-edge fabric technologies, but cut them in silhouettes that reference very distinct historical periods, like using technical sports fabric in designs that kind of echo the 1950s housewives attire. And this temporal collusion creates garments that exist outside of clear historical categorization. And that's exactly the reason why I always say that Prada is one of the most timeless brands out there, because they don't care about trends. Obviously, they are the trend forecasters, kind of. They don't care about trends. And even the references, even the historical references where you're like, okay, that looks 50s, that looks Victorian, that looks 80s. It's not about the reference. It will not be an 80s show. It will not be, even if you can sometimes see inspirations by Balenciaga or Givenchy. In the back from Cristobal Balenciaga and Hubert de Givenchy, not from the current designs. You will see, okay, this is definitely inspired by it, but it is so reinterpreted, it loses its historical relevancy. And the fact that this new item has absolutely no connotation and no reference to the past anymore is what it makes it truly modern. And what separates Prada's design oddity from a lot of other avant-garde designers is the idea of functionality that always remains. Even at their strangest, Prada pieces remain wearable. The insistence that oddity remain practical rather than purely conceptual has allowed Prada's influence to extend beyond the runway into everyday life. We talked about pattern and design. One thing that is coming very close, and I think that is also pretty relevant to mention when it comes to oddness, is the castings. Miuccia Prada selects different when it comes to choosing people for the castings, or the casting director, whoever it is. And I hope nobody considers being odd when chosen for a Miuccia Prada show as something negative, because I think it's the biggest compliment you can get right now in the mainstream world that we're in. I think the Prada casting choices represent perhaps the most visible manifestation of the brand's commitment to an odd kind of beauty. In an industry where very long the conventional attractiveness dominated, Prada kind of pioneered with what could be called the anti-glamour casting. The revolution began already in the 1990s, when Miuccia Prada already had a very distinct selection of models, and that was pretty unusual back in the days. They were selecting models with very distinctive and unconventional features, with maybe a prominent nose, close-set eyes, or unusual proportions. We of course had models like Amber Valletta with her otherworldly intensity, or Sasha Pivovarova with her alien-like features that came to define the new Prada look. A look that probably required a tiny bit more intellectual engagement rather than just instant gratification. But what distinguishes these models is not only their unconventional appearance, it's the intellectual presence that they project. Prada models rarely smile in campaigns. Instead, they gaze at the viewer with a seriousness that suggests they're engaged in thought rather than display. This intellectual quality transforms the traditional passive role of models into something more challenging and active. We had photographers like Albert Watson, Peter Lindbergh, and Stephen Meisel that captured models, including Amber Valletta, Linda Evangelista, and Christy Turlington, in stark, almost clinical environments characterized by muted lighting and minimal styling. And these images conveyed kind of the intellectual sobriety at odds with fashion's typical idea of glamour back then. The models often appeared caught in private moments of contemplation rather than performing for the camera, and that's what the critics termed back then anti-fashion. This aesthetic, deliberately unglamorous yet intensely cerebral, perfectly visualized Miuccia Prada's subversive approach to luxury, presenting clothes and accessories as objects worthy of serious consideration rather than just decorative items. Another thing where we see kind of the oddness of Prada peeking through is probably the choice of the brand ambassadors when we look at them, especially the actors, where when we think about them, like Carey Mulligan, William Dafoe, Christoph Waltz, are very interesting and talented actors. But it's not only that. It's also the idea of pairing unconventional attractiveness with intellectual presence, which is kind of the brand's cerebral approach to fashion. And the last thing that I want to talk about when it comes to understanding the oddity that comes with Prada is the venues. And no, I don't think venues are so relevant for a lot of brands, but when it comes to Prada, it's probably just as important to look at the venue and the space than on the fashion. And what a coincidence, I am the person that was lucky enough to interview Professor Vesma Contere-Mekian, who wrote a whole book called Fashion Spaces with the example of Prada, where you see the first time ever a real analysis and understanding of fashion and space. And we were lucky enough to interview her on our Discord channel. So we had like 2 or 3 hours with her where we asked her a lot of questions, and she was extremely funny. I recorded the session. You can watch it on my Patreon if you subscribe. And if you stay there, you can attend the next ones as well. The next one is a video that I'm publishing next week, and it will be an interview that I had with a very successful buyer that now built up his own company and is working on spaces again. So if you're interested in these kind of business professional talks, Discord link is below. In any case, when speaking about Prada and spaces, there's of course only one name you care about, and that's OMA. And OMA, which stands for Office for Metropolitan Architecture, is an internationally acclaimed architecture firm founded by Rem Koolhaas, known for its innovative, boundary-pushing designs that blend intellectual theory with provocative spatial concepts, transforming not just physical environments but cultural and urban experiences across the globe. And I'm not pretty sure anymore, but I think they are creating the spaces now for 30 years for Prada. Or not completely, like it's like 26 years or something. OMA, especially Rem Koolhaas, he is the one who did the Fondazione Prada. So it's an insane architectural bureau. And when it comes to oddity, it is something we find at OMA and the way they work. One show that had a very interesting venue was the Fall 2017 Women's Wear Show, which felt a bit like a maze in a domestic setting that was simultaneously familiar and unsettling at the same time. OMA created a sequence of interconnected rooms using wooden partitions covered in synthetic materials, mimicking domestic surfaces like cork, formica, or linoleum. And the uncanny valley effect of these almost but not quite homely spaces perfectly complemented Miuccia Prada's collection, which featured nostalgic 70s patterns and silhouettes that were distorted through exaggerated proportions and unexpected material combinations like mohair with plastic, feathers with technical fabrics. And the spatial design created a disorienting journey where models emerged from doorways that seemed to lead nowhere, embodying Prada's signature, a contradiction between nostalgia and futurism. Another visually interesting show was Spring 2019. For this show, OMA designed a space with clear plastic stools arranged in neat rows on top of a wavy see-through floor filled with bright colored liquid that moved during the show. Metal scaffolding hung above, creating a contrast between hard structured elements and flowing shapeless ones, and the space felt both natural and man-made, and at the same time like a strange landscape that seems a bit ancient and somehow also futuristic. And this matched the clothes in the collection, which took outdoor and practical clothing and remade them with bright synthetic colors and technical fabrics, blurring a bit the lines between natural and artificial, and something Prada often does in their designs. I'm not an architect, but I'm very sure that whenever we go into a Prada venue space and check the details of what OMA has created, it's incredible in what kind of details they're able to reflect the same energy of the collection every time. All of these things combined, the brand history, the philosophy, the design, the venues, the castings, all of these things all together have one thing in common, and it's the feeling that something's odd here and that we're not sure of what we're receiving right now and if we like it or not and how we should feel about it. And this is the very unique feeling that only Miuccia Prada's design can evoke in the viewer. And today I tried to get this a bit closer to you, and I hope this helped you a bit more to understand why it takes a bit more time to understand what it's about, because it's not only about fashion, there are way more things going on. And it is on purpose, though, that you don't understand it immediately. We have similarities to avant-garde designers, and in another video I would really like to talk about Miuccia Prada in comparison to the works of avant-garde designers like Yohji Yamamoto or Rei Kawakubo, because there are a lot of similarities. But this is for another time. See you to the next video, and subscribe to the Patreon if you want more from this. See you next week.